The rain fell in sheets that night, drumming against the rusted fire escape like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. 14-year-old Ethan Cross sat on the edge of his apartment building's rooftop, legs dangling over the precipice, watching the city lights blur through the downpour. This was his sanctuary, the only place where the noise of his fractured home life couldn't reach him. His parents' screaming had become white noise, a constant symphony of disappointment and rage that echoed through their cramped 3-bedroom walk-up. Up here, 6 stories above the chaos, he could breathe. He didn't come up here to escape tonight, though. He came because of the dreams. For 3 weeks, Ethan had been plagued by visions of this rooftop, not as it was, but transformed. In his dreams, the cracked concrete and peeling paint dissolved into something otherworldly. A shimmering aperture of light would materialize just beyond the old water tower, pulsing with colors that didn't exist in any spectrum he'd ever seen. Blues that tasted like electricity. Purples that hummed with ancient songs. And always, a voice calling his name from somewhere beyond the light, promising answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. The psychiatrist his mother dragged him to called them stress-induced hallucinations. The pills she prescribed sat untouched in his desk drawer. Because Ethan knew, with a certainty that lived in his bones, that the dreams weren't random firings of an adolescent brain under pressure. They were invitations. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the rooftop in stark white relief. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Ethan saw it. Right where the dreams had shown him, next to the water tower, a distortion in the air, like heat rising from summer asphalt, except the temperature had dropped to near freezing. His breath caught in his throat. He stood slowly, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead, and took a step toward the anomaly. It vanished. "Come on," he whispered, frustration bleeding into his voice. "I'm here. I showed up. What do you want from me?" As if in response, the air began to thicken. The rain slowed, each droplet suspending in mid-air like the world had been caught in amber. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times, the portal erupted into existence. It was nothing like the dreams. This was raw, violent, beautiful in the way a hurricane is beautiful, all terrible power and merciless force. The aperture spanned 8 feet in diameter, a swirling vortex of impossible colors that rotated clockwise, then counterclockwise, then in directions that hurt to perceive. At its center was absolute darkness, but not the darkness of night. This was the darkness before creation, pregnant with potential and humming with a frequency that made Ethan's teeth ache. The voice came again, not through his ears but directly into his mind, bypassing language entirely. It spoke in concepts, in emotions, in truths that bypassed conscious thought and embedded themselves directly into his soul. It showed him glimpses, fractured images of himself older, wiser, standing in places that couldn't exist. It showed him a world on the brink of something catastrophic, and a choice only he could make. It showed him purpose. Ethan's legs moved without conscious decision. 1 step. 2. The rain had stopped entirely now, suspended in perfect spheres that reflected the portal's light like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Behind him, the door to the stairwell burst open. His father's voice cut through the impossible silence. "Ethan, get away from there." But Richard Cross's voice sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from underwater. Ethan glanced back and saw his father frozen mid-step, mouth open in a scream that would never complete, eyes wide with terror. Time had stopped for everyone but him. The portal was giving him a choice, and it was making sure nothing would interfere. He turned back to the swirling void. Fear coursed through him, primal, instinctive, the same fear that kept ancient humans from entering dark caves. But beneath it, something else stirred. Curiosity. Hope. A desperate, aching need to be anywhere but here, to be anyone but the scared kid whose parents hated each other more than they loved him. "What's on the other side?" he asked the void. The answer came not in words but in feeling. Everything. Nothing. The space between heartbeats where all possibilities exist simultaneously. A chance to matter. Ethan reached out his hand. The portal's edge felt like touching liquid starlight, cool, electric, alive. Energy raced up his arm, not painful but intense, rewriting something fundamental in his cellular structure. For a moment, clarity struck him with the force of revelation. This wasn't a portal through space. It was a portal through time itself, and crossing its threshold would unmoor him from the river of causality that governed everything else in existence. The question wasn't what would happen if he jumped. The question was what would happen if he didn't. Behind him, his father remained frozen, 1 foot raised, arms outstretched in a futile attempt to grab him. The man's face was twisted in anguish, real, genuine fear for his son's safety. It was perhaps the first time Ethan had seen his father's mask crack in years. A tiny voice in the back of his mind whispered that he should step back, that this was insanity, that there were other ways to escape. But Ethan was 14, and 14-year-olds don't always make the safe choice. They make the choice that feels true. He jumped. The portal swallowed him whole. For an immeasurable instant, Ethan existed everywhere and nowhere. He saw his birth and his death simultaneously. He saw versions of himself making different choices, living different lives. He saw the threads of causality that connected every moment to every other moment, a vast web of consequence stretching from the universe's first moment to its last. He saw things human minds weren't meant to comprehend, and felt his consciousness threatening to shatter under the weight of infinite perspective. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The cosmic vision collapsed back into singular perception. Ethan's feet hit solid ground, and he stumbled forward, gasping, his mind reeling from the journey. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus, trying to understand where, or when, he had landed. He was still on a rooftop. But not his rooftop. The water tower was gone, replaced by sleek solar panels and atmospheric processes he didn't recognize. The skyline had transformed into something from a science fiction novel, towers that curved like organic growths, sky bridges connecting impossible heights, vehicles moving through the air on invisible currents. And above it all, a sky that wasn't quite the right color, as if the atmosphere itself had been altered. Ethan spun in a slow circle, panic rising in his chest. The portal had closed behind him. There was no swirling void, no doorway home. Just this alien cityscape and the dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake. A sound made him freeze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, ascending the rooftop access stairs. The door, sleek and metallic where his had been rusted steel, slid open with a pneumatic hiss. A woman emerged. She was perhaps 40, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a uniform that looked simultaneously military and civilian. But it was her eyes that stopped Ethan's heart. Because as she stared at him, recognition bloomed across her face, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition. As if she'd been waiting for this moment. "Ethan Cross," she said, and her voice cracked on his name. "You're really here. After all these years, you're finally here." She pulled out a device that looked like a phone merged with a hologram projector. A date materialized in the air between them, glowing with soft blue light. June 14th, 2045. Ethan had jumped 20 years into the future. But his reflection in the rooftop's glass door told him what his body already knew: he hadn't aged a single day. The woman took a step closer, and Ethan instinctively backed away, his sneakers scraping against the unfamiliar rooftop surface. His mind struggled to process the impossibility standing before him, not just the transformed city or the wrong sky, but the way this stranger looked at him. Like he was a ghost. Like he was a miracle. Like he was something she'd mourned and given up hope of ever seeing again. "Stay back," Ethan managed, his voice cracking. "I don't. Who are you? How do you know my name?" The woman stopped, raising both hands in a gesture of peace. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion barely held in check. "My God, you really don't know me, do you? Of course you don't. For you, it's only been seconds. For me..." She laughed, but it was a broken sound. "For me, it's been 20 years of wondering if you were dead or lost in some temporal void. 20 years of hoping you'd come back." She reached slowly into her uniform pocket, and Ethan tensed, but she only withdrew a photograph. The image was printed on some kind of flexible material that seemed to glow from within. She held it out, and after a moment's hesitation, Ethan stepped forward to take it. The photo showed two teenagers, a boy and a girl, maybe 16 or 17, sitting on a rooftop. His rooftop, he realized, though it looked different, cleaner, with flowering plants in makeshift containers. The boy was him, or would be him in a couple of years, same dark hair, same sharp jawline, but taller, more filled out. The girl had warm brown skin and eyes that crinkled with genuine joy as she laughed at something off camera. They sat close together, shoulders touching, in the easy intimacy of people who knew each other's souls. "That's us," the woman said softly. "You and me. Ethan and Maya. Best friends since the 3rd grade. Or at least, that's what we were supposed to be. That's what we were in every timeline except this one." Ethan looked up from the photograph to the woman's face, searching for any trace of the girl in the image. The bone structure was there, he supposed, in the cheekbones and the shape of her eyes. But the weight of 2 decades had transformed her into someone he couldn't recognize. "I don't understand," he whispered. "I don't know you. I've never." "You vanished 3 weeks before this photo was supposed to be taken," Maya interrupted, her voice gaining strength as she slipped into what sounded like a well-rehearsed explanation. "June 3rd, 2025. Your father said you went up to the roof during a storm and just disappeared. No body. No evidence. No explanation. The police investigated for months, but eventually, you were declared a runaway. Your parents divorced 6 months later. Your father drank himself to death within 5 years. Your mother..." She paused, something painful crossing her face. "Your mother never stopped looking. She died last year, still believing you'd come home." The words hit Ethan like physical blows. His mother, dead. His father, gone. An entire lifetime of consequence cascading from the single moment he'd chosen to jump. The photograph trembled in his hands. "But I don't know you," he repeated, desperate for something to make sense. "In my timeline, I've never met anyone named Maya. Because the portal changed everything." Maya's expression hardened, shifting from grief to something more clinical, more dangerous. "When you jumped, you didn't just travel through time, you created a temporal divergence point. The moment you vanished, reality split. In one branch, the branch you came from, I never existed. Or maybe I existed somewhere else, went to a different school, lived a completely different life. But in this branch, the branch you landed in, we were inseparable. I was there the night you discovered the portal. I was there when you jumped. And I've spent the last 20 years trying to understand what happened and how to bring you back." She gestured to the transformed city around them. "This world, Ethan, it's not the natural progression of your timeline. After you vanished, things started changing. Slowly at first, then accelerating. Technology advanced at an impossible rate. New discoveries emerged from nowhere, as if someone was deliberately pushing human progress forward. And at the center of it all, there were whispers. Rumors of something called the Temporal Accord, an organization that claimed to be protecting the timeline from catastrophic paradoxes." Maya's hand moved to a badge clipped to her uniform, and Ethan saw the symbol etched into its surface, an Ouroboros, the ancient snake eating its own tail, but rendered in sharp geometric lines that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "I joined them," she continued. 5 years ago, after every other avenue led to dead ends. They recruited me specifically because of my connection to you. Because somewhere in their vast archives of temporal data, they had records of this moment. They knew you would return. They knew when and where. And they've been preparing." "Preparing for what?" Ethan asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Maya's expression went cold, and for the first time, Ethan noticed the weapon holstered at her hip, sleek, compact, humming with barely contained energy. "To send you back. To close the loop and restore timeline integrity. Because your presence here, in this time, as an unchanged 14-year-old boy from 2025, represents a Category 5 temporal anomaly. Every second you remain creates ripples of causality that could collapse the entire continuum. Before Ethan could respond, the rooftop access door burst open again. 3 figures in tactical gear emerged, moving with practiced precision. They carried weapons similar to Maya's, but larger, more aggressive. Their faces were hidden behind helmets with dark visors, transforming them into faceless instruments of authority. "Agent Torres," one of them said, voice distorted through a modulator. "Step away from the anomaly. Director Chen wants him contained and transported immediately." Maya didn't move. "I'm handling this, Officer Blake. The subject is cooperative and—" "That wasn't a request, Agent." The officer's weapon rose, not pointing at Ethan but angled in a way that suggested readiness. "Your personal connection to the anomaly makes you compromised. We have our orders." Something shifted in Maya's posture. The grief and nostalgia that had softened her features vanished, replaced by the hard edge of someone who'd spent 20 years in a world that had betrayed her. "And what are those orders, exactly? Because last I checked, the Accord's mandate was preservation, not erasure." "The anomaly returns to 2025 via controlled temporal regression," Blake stated flatly. "Non-negotiable. Director Chen has determined that his continued presence poses an unacceptable risk to—" "To what?" Maya's voice rose. "To the timeline? Or to the Accord's monopoly on temporal manipulation? Because I've seen the classified files, Blake. I know what they're really afraid of. It's not paradox. It's competition." The officer's weapon shifted, now unmistakably aimed at Maya. "You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Surrender your badge and weapon, or be classified as hostile to temporal security." Ethan's mind raced. Nothing about this made sense. He jumped through a portal 3 minutes ago, and now he was standing in the middle of what felt like a Cold War standoff over his existence. But beneath the confusion, something else stirred, the same instinct that had driven him to jump in the first place. A certainty that the easy path, the path of compliance and surrender, was the wrong one. Maya must have seen something in his expression because she turned to him, and for just a moment, their eyes met. In that instant, Ethan saw not a stranger, but an echo of the friendship that should have been. The bond that existed in some other version of reality where they'd grown up together, where they'd shared secrets on rooftops and defended each other against the cruelties of adolescence. "Run," she whispered. Then everything exploded into chaos. Maya drew her weapon in one fluid motion, firing not at the officers but at the solar panels behind them. The blast erupted in a shower of sparks and electrical discharge, creating a wall of interference that scrambled their targeting systems. She grabbed Ethan's arm and yanked him toward the edge of the rooftop. "Are you insane?" Ethan shouted, but Maya was already pulling him forward. "Trust me," she yelled back. They reached the edge, and for one terrifying moment, Ethan thought she meant to throw them both off. 6 stories of empty air gaped below them, ready to dash their bodies against the street. But Maya's hand slapped against what looked like a blank section of rooftop railing, and suddenly a platform materialized beneath them, some kind of emergency descent system that hadn't existed a second ago. The platform dropped, controlled but fast, as energy weapons discharged above them. Bolts of concentrated plasma seared the air where they'd been standing moments before. Wind whipped Ethan's hair as they plummeted, the transformed city rushing past in a blur of lights and impossible architecture. "Where are we going?" Ethan gasped, gripping the platform's edge so hard his knuckles went white. "Somewhere the Accord can't follow," Maya replied, her jaw set with determination. "Somewhere that exists outside the official timeline. There are gaps, Ethan. Places where reality got messy during the temporal shifts. Places where people like us, people who remember things differently, who got caught in the crossfire of changing timelines, hide from the authorities." The platform hit street level and dissolved beneath them. Maya took off running, and Ethan had no choice but to follow. The city at ground level was even more disorienting than from above. Vehicles hummed past on magnetic rails. Holographic advertisements shifted and changed, tracking their movement and offering targeted products in languages Ethan couldn't identify. People, so many people, more diverse than his 2025 mind could process, moved through the streets with practiced efficiency, barely glancing at the running figures. Maya pulled him into an alley that seemed to twist in ways alleys shouldn't. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, shouted orders, the whine of charging weapons, the mechanical precision of trained officers moving through an urban environment. The alley opened into a courtyard that couldn't possibly fit in the space it occupied. Market stalls lined the walls, selling everything from fresh produce to devices that pulsed with their own internal light. But it was the people that caught Ethan's attention. They all shared a certain quality, a displacement, a sense of not quite belonging. They looked at Maya and Ethan with knowing eyes. The underground, Maya explained, slowing to a walk, started appearing about 10 years ago. The Accord pretends it doesn't exist, but they can't touch it. The temporal mechanics that created these spaces make them slippery, hard to pin down. She led him to a door at the far end of the courtyard, marked with the same Ouroboros symbol from her badge but inverted, the snake's head facing outward instead of inward. She knocked 3 times, paused, then twice more. The door opened, revealing a man who looked to be in his 60s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. He took one look at Ethan and went very still. "Sweet merciful Christ," he breathed. "It's true. The loop really did close. After all these years, you actually came back." "Dr. Reeves," Maya said urgently, "we need sanctuary. The Accord is right behind us, and they have orders to forcibly regress him." Dr. Reeves stepped aside, ushering them in quickly. "Get inside. We have maybe 3 minutes before they breach the spatial membrane. That'll give us just enough time for me to explain why everything you think you know about that portal is wrong." As the doors sealed behind them, Ethan heard the distant sound of officers entering the courtyard. But it was Dr. Reeves's words that made his blood run cold. "That portal didn't just move you through time, son. It moved you between timelines. And the reason you haven't aged isn't because time stopped for you. It's because you're not supposed to exist in this reality at all. You're a paradox made flesh. And paradoxes, Ethan," his expression turned grave. "Paradoxes attract other paradoxes. Something followed you through that portal. Something that's been hiding in the spaces between seconds, waiting for you to return. And now that you're here, now that the loop is closed, it's finally free to emerge." Behind them, the door began to shudder as the Accord's forces attempted to breach it. But beneath that sound, barely audible, came something else. A rhythm. A pulse. Like the heartbeat of something vast and hungry, counting down to the moment it could be born into a reality that had no defenses against it. Dr. Reeves moved with surprising speed for a man his age, his hands flying across a holographic interface that materialized from a device strapped to his wrist. The room they'd entered was larger than the building's exterior suggested, another spatial impossibility that Ethan's exhausted mind simply added to the growing list of things that shouldn't exist. Banks of monitors lined the walls, each displaying cascading data streams, temporal graphs, and what looked like maps of branching timelines that split and merged in dizzying patterns. "Lock it down," Reeves barked to someone Ethan couldn't see in the shadows of the room. "Triple layer the membrane and route the anchor points through the Kensington Junction. That'll buy us maybe 10 minutes before they realize we're not actually here anymore." "Wait, what?" Ethan managed, but Maya was already pulling him deeper into the space. "The underground exists in a state of quantum superposition," she explained rapidly, her voice taking on the clipped efficiency of someone defaulting to technical details to avoid processing trauma. "When you enter, you're simultaneously in multiple locations across the city. The Accord knows these places exist, but pinning down which space you're actually occupying requires." "Maya, he doesn't need a physics lecture right now," Reeves interrupted, finally looking up from his interface. His eyes found Ethan's, and something in them made the boy's skin crawl, not malice, but a desperate urgency tinged with what looked like guilt. "He needs to understand what he is. What he's become." The pulsing sound grew louder. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a rhythmic thrumming that Ethan felt in his teeth, in his bones, in the spaces between his thoughts. The monitors flickered, their displays momentarily corrupted by static that resolved into patterns, fractals that looked disturbingly organic, like neural pathways or the branching of blood vessels. When you jumped through that portal, Reeves began, moving to a large display that dominated one wall, you became what we call a temporal anchor. Your consciousness, your physical form, everything that makes you got locked at that specific moment in space-time. You're 14 years old, and you'll always be 14 years old, no matter how much time passes around you. But that's not the dangerous part. He pulled up an image, a three-dimensional model of what looked like a DNA helix, except the strands were made of light and seemed to phase in and out of existence. Every living thing has a temporal signature, a unique pattern that ties it to the flow of causality. But yours. He zoomed in, and Ethan saw that where the strands should connect, there were gaps. Empty spaces. Yours is incomplete. Fractured. Like a jigsaw puzzle missing half its pieces. And nature, reality itself, abhors incompleteness. Maya had moved to another console, her fingers dancing across controls as she monitored something Ethan couldn't see. The entity he's talking about, Ethan, we've been tracking it for 12 years. It started as minor temporal anomalies. Moments that repeated. Déjà vu events that affected entire city blocks. People remembering things that hadn't happened yet, or forgetting things that had. We thought it was just residual instability from the initial divergence point when you vanished. But 3 years ago, the pattern changed, Reeves continued, his voice dropping to something that might have been fear or both. The anomalies started clustering. Organizing. They began to display what we can only describe as intentionality. Purpose. Like something was learning, growing, using the fractured timelines as a substrate for its own development. He pulled up surveillance footage, dozens of clips from across the city. In each one, Ethan saw the same thing, a distortion in the air, like heat shimmer, except it moved with purpose. In one clip, it passed through a crowded plaza, and for just a moment, everyone froze. Not stopped, but frozen, their expressions locked in whatever emotion they'd been feeling, amplified to inhuman extremes. Joy became manic ecstasy. Sadness became crushing despair. Fear became existential terror. Then it passed, and people stumbled, confused, unable to remember what had just overwhelmed them. We call it the Devourer, Maya said quietly. Because that's what it does. It feeds on temporal energy, on the quantum possibility that exists at every moment of choice. And the biggest source of that energy, the brightest beacon in the entire timeline, is me, Ethan finished, his voice hollow. I'm what it's been hunting. Reeves nodded grimly. Your incomplete temporal signature creates a void, a hunger in the fabric of causality. And this entity, we think it's not a creature in any biological sense, but a pattern. A self-organizing system that emerged from the chaos of colliding timelines. It's been drawn to you since the moment you jumped, but it couldn't manifest fully because you weren't here. You were displaced, existing in a bubble of frozen time. But now that you've returned, now that your paradox exists in the same timeline as the instability you created. The pulsing stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. Every monitor in the room went dark simultaneously. The holographic displays collapsed. Even the ambient hum of electronics died, leaving them in a darkness so complete that Ethan couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. Then light returned, but wrong. The monitors flickered back to life, but their displays showed the same image on every screen, the rooftop. His rooftop, as it had looked 20 years ago on the night he jumped. Rain falling. His father frozen mid-step. And standing at the edge, looking directly into the camera with eyes that weren't quite human anymore, was himself. Except it wasn't. The proportions were wrong, too tall, limbs too long, face stretched in a smile that extended past where the corners of a mouth should end. It wore his features like a mask that didn't quite fit. Oh God, Maya breathed. It's already anchored. It's using the memory of the divergence point as a bridgehead. The not Ethan on the screens tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. Then it spoke, and its voice came from everywhere, from the monitors, from the walls, from inside Ethan's own skull. "Found you." The room lurched. Reality itself seemed to shudder, and suddenly they weren't in the underground anymore. The walls dissolved, the equipment vanished, and Ethan found himself standing on his rooftop again, but a version that existed nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. He could see the 2025 version with its rust and decay. He could see the 2045 version with its solar panels and atmospheric processes. He could see dozens of other versions, all overlapping, all equally real and unreal. And in the center of it all, the entity stood. It had abandoned any pretense of humanity. Its form shifted constantly, cycling through every version of Ethan that could have existed across every timeline: child, teenager, adult, elderly, dying, dead, never born. A kaleidoscope of possibilities made manifest. "You don't understand what you are," it said, and now its voice was a chorus, thousands of Ethans speaking in imperfect unison. "Neither do they. The old man with his theories. The girl with her guilt. They think you're an anchor. They think you're a paradox. But you're so much more." Dr. Reeves appeared beside Ethan, then Maya on his other side. But they looked translucent, like ghosts. Like they weren't fully here in this space between spaces. "Don't listen to it," Reeves called out, his voice distorted. "It's a predator. It's trying to complete me." The entity laughed, and the sound was breaking glass and crying children and the last breath of dying stars. "No, Doctor. I'm trying to show him the truth. That he and I are the same thing. Two halves of a paradox. The boy who jumped, and the possibility of what that jump created. I am every path not taken. Every choice unmade. Every timeline that collapsed when he decided to leap into the unknown." It moved closer, and with each step, reality rippled. Ethan saw glimpses of other lives, versions of himself who'd stayed on the rooftop, who'd become the person in Maya's photograph, who'd grown old and died having never known the portal existed. He saw versions where he jumped and landed in different times, different worlds. He saw versions where the jump killed him, where he became trapped in the void between moments, screaming for eternity in a place where no one could hear. "We are the uncollapsed wave function," the entity continued, its form stabilizing into something that looked more like him but felt utterly alien. "Schrodinger's boy, simultaneously here and not here, alive and not alive, real and not real. And the only way to resolve the paradox, the only way to stop the timeline from tearing itself apart, is for one of us to cease existing," Ethan finished, understanding flooding through him with terrible clarity. The entity smiled, and this time it was almost gentle. "Finally, you understand. But here's the question, Ethan Cross, which one of us is the original? Which one of us has the right to exist? You, the boy who jumped and froze in time? Or me, the living embodiment of every consequence that jump created? Every life changed, every timeline altered, every possibility that exploded outward from that single moment of choice." Maya's ghostly form tried to move forward but couldn't seem to cross some invisible threshold. "Ethan, don't let it manipulate you. It's not offering a choice, it's trying to convince you to surrender, to let it absorb you and become fully real." "But I'm already real," the entity said softly. "I'm more real than he is. I've existed for 20 years, growing, learning, becoming. He's just a frozen moment, a snapshot that refuses to move forward. Who deserves to continue? The static photograph or the living timeline?" Ethan's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to reject this thing that wore his face. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A terrible curiosity. Because the entity was right about one thing, Ethan was incomplete. He'd felt it from the moment he'd landed in 2045, a wrongness in his own existence. Like he was a copy made from a degraded template, missing essential components that made a person whole. "What happens if I agree?" he asked quietly. "What happens if I let you complete the paradox?" "Ethan, no." Maya's voice was distant, fading. The entity stepped closer, and now it looked exactly like him, not stretched or distorted, but perfect. A mirror image that moved with fluid grace. We merge. Two halves becoming whole. You get to move forward, to age, to exist properly in the timeline. And I get to stop being a collection of possibilities and become a single, solid reality. We both win. And the timeline stabilizes. The devourer stops devouring because there's nothing left to devour. The temporal anomalies cease. Reality returns to normal, or as normal as it can be after 20 years of quantum chaos. The entity extended its hand. We were always meant to be one, Ethan. The jump split us, and the return is meant to unite us. It's elegant. It's right. It's the only way forward. Ethan stared at the offered hand. Behind the entity, he could see the overlapping rooftops beginning to collapse inward, the various timelines starting to merge and cancel each other out. He could feel the pull of it, the seductive promise of completion, of finally being whole. Dr. Reeves's voice cut through the moment, sharp with urgency. Ethan, the DNA model. Remember the DNA model? Ethan's eyes widened. The fractured temporal signature. The missing pieces that made him incomplete. But if he was missing pieces, then so was the entity. They were both half-formed, both paradoxes. And merging two incomplete things didn't create something whole, it just created a bigger paradox. You're lying, Ethan said, stepping back. If merging would stabilize everything, the temporal accord wouldn't be trying to send me back. They'd be trying to push us together. But they are not. They are trying to separate us completely, which means... The entity's expression twisted into something inhuman. Which means merging us would destroy everything. Yes. Very clever, boy. But I wasn't offering you a choice. I was offering you comfort before the inevitable. It lunged forward, its form exploding into that kaleidoscope of possibilities again. But this time, each version reached for Ethan with hands that passed through physical matter, seeking something deeper. His temporal signature. His quantum state. The frozen moment of his existence that it needed to anchor itself fully to reality. Maya's voice screamed something Ethan couldn't make out. Reeves was shouting coordinates, equations, instructions that might as well have been in another language. The rooftops collapsed further, realities bleeding into each other until there was nothing but chaos and the entity's countless hands reaching for his soul. And then, impossibly, another voice cut through the madness. A voice Ethan knew better than his own. Get away from my son. Standing at the edge of the collapsing space, somehow present despite being dead for 15 years in this timeline, was Richard Cross. But not the terrified father frozen midstep from 2025. This was a version Ethan had never seen, older, harder, with eyes that had seen too much and refused to look away. And he was holding something that pulsed with the same energy as the portal. A device that hummed with temporal power. A key that could reopen doors that were meant to stay closed. Dad. Ethan whispered. Richard Cross smiled, and it was sad and proud and full of regrets for choices not made and time not spent. Hold on, kiddo. I'm getting you out of here. I'm taking you home. The real home. The one where none of this ever happened. He activated the device, and reality screamed. The device in Richard Cross's hands tore reality apart like tissue paper. The overlapping rooftops, all those impossible versions existing simultaneously, began to unravel, peeling away in layers that screamed as they separated. The entity that wore Ethan's face recoiled, its kaleidoscope form flickering and destabilizing as the temporal energy washed over it. No, it shrieked, and the voice was no longer a chorus but something singular, desperate. You're dead. You died in 2030. I consumed that timeline. You don't exist anymore. Richard's smile was grim, and for the first time, Ethan saw the cost written in his father's face, the deep lines around his eyes, the gray that dominated his hair, the way he held himself like a man who'd carried impossible weight for too long. You consumed a timeline, sure, but not the only one. Not the first one. The original branch, where I spent every day since my son vanished trying to figure out how to bring him back. He moved forward, and the entity retreated. Behind Richard, another portal was forming, not the violent, chaotic vortex that had swallowed Ethan 20 years ago, but something more controlled, more precise. It looked like a doorway carved from crystallized time itself, showing glimpses of a familiar rooftop in the rain, a moment frozen in amber. "Dad, I don't understand," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "How are you here? How is any of this possible?" Richard's eyes found his son's, and they were wet with tears he refused to let fall. "Because when you vanished, I didn't give up. Your mother wanted to believe you ran away, wanted to accept that you'd chosen to leave us. But I knew better. I'd seen your face in that last moment before you jumped, not running from something, but toward it. So I dedicated everything to understanding what had taken you." The entity lunged again, but the temporal energy radiating from Richard's device created a barrier it couldn't cross. It hammered against the invisible wall, its form cycling through increasingly desperate configurations: child, monster, shadow, light, everything and nothing. "It took me 5 years to find the first clues," Richard continued, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "References in old texts to temporal phenomena. Myths about doorways between moments. I found others who'd experienced similar losses, people whose loved ones had simply stepped out of reality and never returned. We formed a network, shared research, pooled resources. And eventually, we found him." He gestured to where Dr. Reeves's ghostly form was slowly solidifying, becoming more present. The old man looked at Richard with something like reverence. "Dr. Marcus Reeves," Richard said. "Former MIT physicist who lost his daughter to a temporal anomaly in 2019. He'd been researching the phenomenon for 6 years before I found him. Together, we built the underground. Not the one you saw in 2045, that came later, after we'd already established the foundation. We created spaces outside official timelines, places where we could work without the temporal accord's interference." Maya's form was solidifying too, becoming less transparent. She stared at Richard with wide eyes. "You're the founder. The one the archives mention but never name. The person who started the resistance against the Accord before it was even called the Accord. Oh my God, we thought you were a myth." "Myths are just truths that haven't been properly documented," Richard replied. Then his expression hardened. "But we're running out of time. That device I'm holding? It's a temporal anchor of my own design. It's locked onto the original divergence point, the exact moment Ethan jumped. And it can create a bridge back to that moment, but only for a few seconds. Maybe less." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. "You're saying I can go back? Undo all of this?" "Not undo," Dr. Reeves interjected, his voice gaining strength as his form became solid. "Redirect. If you return to the moment of the jump and choose differently, you'll create a new branch, a timeline where you never left, where none of this temporal chaos ever happened. But this timeline, this version of reality, will still exist. The entity, the underground, Maya, all of it. It just won't be your problem anymore." "But it'll be someone's problem," Ethan said quietly. He looked at the entity, still battering against the barrier, and saw something he hadn't before. Beneath the horror and the hunger, there was pain. Loneliness. It was a collection of abandoned possibilities, paths not taken that had gained sentience and realized they would never be chosen. It wasn't evil. It was desperate to exist, the same way any living thing fights for survival. "There's another option," Ethan said slowly, an idea forming that felt both insane and utterly right. "Dr. Reeves, you said I'm a temporal anchor, that my signature is incomplete because I'm locked at a single moment. But what if that's not a bug? What if it's a feature?" Reeves's eyes widened with understanding. "You want to use yourself as a stabilization point. Create a permanent fixed moment in the timeline that the entity can anchor to without consuming or merging. It would give it definition, boundaries, a way to exist that doesn't require devouring everything else." "That's insane," Maya breathed. "That would mean staying here. Staying 14 forever, existing as a living paradox for the rest of time. You'd never age, never grow up, never have a normal life. You'd be a monument to a moment that shouldn't exist. Ethan looked at his father. Richard's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, hope that his son could come home, horror at what that homecoming would cost, and something else. Pride. It's your choice, kiddo, Richard said softly. It always was. That's what the portal represented, pure choice, unbound by consequence until you decided to make it real. You can come home. Come back to 2025, to a life where none of this happened. Or you can stay, and maybe, you can save this timeline from eating itself alive. The entity had stopped its assault. It stood motionless on the other side of the barrier, its form stabilizing into a perfect mirror of Ethan. When it spoke, its voice was quiet, almost childlike. Why would you do this for me? I've hunted you. Tried to consume you. I'm everything wrong about what you created. Ethan stepped toward it, close enough that only the barrier separated them. Because I understand what you are. You're every path I didn't take. Every choice I didn't make. Every version of me that could have existed if I'd done things differently. And those versions deserve to exist too. Not by destroying everything else, but by having their own space to be real. He turned to Dr. Reeves. Can you do it? Can you use my temporal signature to create an anchor point that gives it definition without requiring fusion? Reeves was already pulling up calculations on a holographic display, his fingers flying through equations that made Ethan's head hurt to look at. Theoretically, yes. But it would require you to willingly stabilize at your current state permanently. No aging. No natural progression. You'd exist in a quantum loop, experiencing time but not participating in it the way others do. And there's no guarantee it would work. The entity might stabilize, or it might just find a new way to feed. Or it might do what I think it'll do, Ethan said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. It might become something new. Something that helps manage temporal stability instead of destroying it. A guardian instead of a devourer. The entity tilted its head, and for the first time, Ethan saw something like hope flicker across its borrowed features. You really believe that? That I could be more than hunger? I believe things can change, Ethan replied. I believe choices matter, even when they seem impossible. And I believe that the version of me that jumps through a portal in a thunderstorm is the kind of person who'd rather try something crazy than take the safe path home. Richard made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. That's my boy. Reckless to the end. He looked down at the device in his hands, then at the doorway showing that rain-soaked rooftop in 2025. If you do this, I won't be able to come back for you. This device was a one-use prototype. Took 15 years and everything I had to build it. You'll be stuck here, in 2045 and beyond, forever 14, forever apart from everyone you knew. I know, Ethan said. But those people, Dad, they are not my people anymore. You saw the photo Maya showed me. In this timeline, we were supposed to be best friends. And she spent 20 years trying to find me, trying to understand what happened. That's real, even if I don't remember it. This timeline is real, even if it's not the one I came from. And if I can help save it, doesn't that matter more than going back to a life where I was just a scared kid running from his problems? Maya had tears streaming down her face. You don't owe us this. You don't owe me friendship we never got to have. Maybe not, Ethan agreed. But maybe I owe it to myself. To the version of me that could exist here, in this time, if I'm brave enough to choose it. Richard closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were red but clear. Dr. Reeves, what do you need to make this work? The anchor device, recalibrated to create a stabilization field instead of a bridge home. The entity's cooperation, it'll need to willingly synchronize with Ethan's temporal signature. And Ethan's absolute commitment, because once we start the process, there's no reversing it. His quantum state will be locked permanently. I'm sure, Ethan said before anyone could ask. Do it. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Reeves worked with Richard to recalibrate the device, their hands moving in perfect synchronization born of years working toward the same goal. Maya stood with Ethan, not speaking, just being present. The entity watched from beyond the barrier, its expression unreadable. "Ready," Reeves finally announced. "Richard, you need to lower the barrier. The entity has to be able to touch Ethan for the synchronization to work." "If this goes wrong," Richard began, "then I die, and the timeline probably collapses anyway," Ethan finished. "We're past the point of safe options, Dad." Richard's hand trembled as he adjusted the device. The barrier flickered and fell. The entity stood motionless, no longer attacking, just waiting. Ethan stepped forward and extended his hand. "Partners." The entity looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, it reached out. Their fingers touched, and reality convulsed. Ethan felt the entity's consciousness flood into his, not consuming, but sharing. He experienced every timeline it had witnessed, every possibility it embodied. He saw versions of himself happy, sad, successful, broken, alive, dead, and everything in between. He felt the weight of potential, the burden of being every path not taken. And the entity felt him in return. It felt the singular focus of being one person, one choice, one continuous thread of experience. It felt limitation, and in that limitation, found strange comfort. Boundaries. Definition. Purpose. The device in Richard's hands pulsed, and Ethan felt his temporal signature lock into place. He was still himself, still 14, still conscious, still capable of thought and feeling. But he was also something more. An anchor point. A fixed star in the chaos of collapsing timelines. The entity's form began to change. The kaleidoscope of possibilities collapsed inward, but instead of becoming Ethan, it became something new. It retained his general shape but took on its own features, similar enough to be recognizable as related, different enough to be clearly distinct. Where Ethan had dark hair, it had hair that shifted between colors like oil on water. Where Ethan's eyes were brown, its eyes were a swirling mix of every color and none. "I am," it said, and its voice was its own now, not a chorus or a mockery. "I exist. Not as you, but as myself." The echo. The possibility made real through choice rather than consumption. Dr. Reeves was staring at his monitors in awe. The timeline is stabilizing. The temporal anomalies are resolving. It's working. My God, it's actually working. Maya laughed, the sound high and slightly hysterical with relief. The Accord is going to lose their minds. A verified temporal paradox achieving stable existence outside their control framework. This changes everything. Richard approached Ethan slowly, and the boy, forever a boy now, turned to face his father. They looked at each other across the gulf of an impossible choice, and Richard pulled his son into a fierce embrace. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "And I'm so sorry. Sorry that you had to make this choice. Sorry that I couldn't protect you from it." "You did protect me," Ethan replied, his voice muffled against his father's shoulder. "You gave me the option to choose. That's the best protection anyone can offer." They stood like that for a long moment, father and son, separated by timelines but connected by love that transcended causality. Then Richard stepped back, and Ethan saw that the portal behind him, the doorway home to 2025, was beginning to fade. "I have to go," Richard said. "The device is burning out. But know this, Ethan, in my timeline, you'll always be the son who came home. I'll tell your mother you're safe. I'll tell her you made a choice to help people, and that you were brave beyond measure. And I'll make sure that Rooftop portal never activates, so no other scared kid makes the same jump." "Wait," Ethan said urgently. "Will I ever see you again?" Richard smiled sadly. "Time is strange, kiddo. We already saw each other again, from a certain point of view. But if you're asking whether our timelines will intersect once more..." He glanced at Dr. Reeves, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Probably not. But that's okay. Because I got to see the man you're becoming, even if you're stuck at 14. And he's someone worth being proud of." The portal was almost gone now, barely more than a shimmer in the air. Richard backed toward it, his eyes never leaving his son's face. I love you, Ethan. In every timeline. In every possibility. That's the one constant that never changes. I love you too, Dad. Richard Cross stepped backward through the portal, and it sealed behind him with a soft sound like a sigh of relief. The overlapping rooftops finished their collapse, leaving only one version, the 2045 reality, solid and stable. The rain had stopped. The stars were visible through gaps in the clouds, more stars than Ethan remembered seeing from the city, as if reality itself was celebrating its own survival. Maya put a hand on his shoulder. So, what now,